If you hadn't heard the name Jun Fujita before today, you have most likely seen his pictures. Jun Fujita was a pioneering Japanese-born photographer whose journey from his homeland to Canada and ultimately Chicago shaped a singular career in American photojournalism. Today, behind the camera, Jun Fujita's Chicago with author Graham Harrison Lee. I'm Tommy Henry, and this is the Chicago History Podcast. Much of the interview you'll hear in a moment was recorded in December of 2025, but I decided to shelve this episode as the initial run of my guest's book sold out. A pretty cool development to be sure, but I didn't want to get you all excited about a book you weren't going to be able to find. Fortunately, the second printing of the book is almost ready, and if you go to the link in the show's notes, you can save $10 off list price. Get on it! Born near Hiroshima in December 1888, Jun Fujita left Japan as a teenager, traveling to British Columbia on assignment to photograph industries such as salmon fishing and lumbering for a Japanese publication connected to his family. In Canada, he worked a series of odd jobs: porter, servant, and laborer, saving enough money to cross into the United States, drawn by reports that Chicago was affordable and full of opportunity. By about 1909, he settled in Chicago, completed high school at Wendell Phillips Academy, and briefly studied mathematics and physics at the Armour Institute, which later became the Illinois Institute of Technology, initially intending to become an engineer. Instead, he gravitated to photography, joining the Chicago Evening Post by 1915 and becoming widely regarded as the first Japanese-American photojournalist. Before we discuss Jun Fujita more, here's a brief overview of the history of Japanese people in Chicago. Japanese migration to Chicago began in the early 1890s, tied directly to the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition. The first group arrived in 1892 to construct the Ho-Oden Pavilion, a Japanese temple complex at Jackson Park. Among the earliest permanent residents was Kamenosuke Nishi, who moved from San Francisco in 1893, opened a gift shop at 27th and Cottage Grove, and reportedly amassed a small fortune. Other early immigrants opened restaurants, gift shops, and boarding houses, or enrolled at institutions like the University of Chicago. The pre-World War II Japanese community in Chicago remained very small, but unusually assimilated compared to West Coast Japanese enclaves. By 1900, there were roughly a few dozen Japanese residents. By 1930, around 400 to 500 lived in the city, many concentrated in Hyde Park, Kenwood, and Woodlawn on the south side. Many were students or professionals rather than laborers. Because Illinois lacked anti-miscegenation laws, interracial marriages were relatively common. Nearly half of married Japanese men in Chicago in 1910 had non-Japanese spouses. This produced a significant number of mixed-race Nisei children and a community that did not resemble the dense, tightly segregated Japantowns of the West Coast. Everything changed with World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 and the signing of Executive Order 9066 in 1942. About 120,000 Japanese Americans on the West Coast were incarcerated in camps. Beginning in 1943, the War Relocation Authority, or the WRA, began a resettlement program allowing inmates to leave the camps if they agreed to relocate eastward, find work, and avoid forming new ethnic enclaves. Chicago became a major destination because it had few pre-war Japanese residents and a huge demand for wartime labor. Just before the war, Chicago had roughly 500 ethnic Japanese residents. By 1945, that number had exploded to around 20,000. Resettlers found jobs in light manufacturing, food processing, printing, and clerical work. Housing discrimination pushed them into buffer zones between black and white neighborhoods, and two main Japanese American districts emerged. One around 43rd and Cottage Grove on the south side, and another near Clark and Division on the near north side. Churches, language schools, social clubs, and organizations such as the Japanese American Service Committee were founded to meet community needs. By the 1960s, urban renewal projects and demographic shifts pushed many Japanese Americans into Lakeview near Wrigley Field. For several decades, Lakeview functioned as an informal Japantown with restaurants, groceries, barbers, and community institutions lining Clark Street and nearby blocks. Yet, strong pressures to assimilate, reinforced by both government policy and Nisei parents, meant that Japanese language use and overt ethnic institutions faded over time. By the 1980s and 1990s, many Sansei, or third-generation families, had moved to Chicago's suburbs like Arlington Heights and Schaumburg, and Lakeview's visible Japanese American presence largely disappeared. Now then, back to Jun Fujita to discuss the book. Jun Fujita Behind the Camera and Jun Fujita's Life is the author of said book, who happens to be Jun Fujita's great-nephew, Graham Harrison Lee. Graham Harrison Lee, welcome.
Thank you so much, Tommy. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today.
Before we get to the book, tell us a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, where you are now, and why Chicago is your favorite city.
Well, let's see. I grew up in Michigan, spent beginning years in lower Michigan, Ann Arbor area. A story for another time could be why my parents decided to build a 50-foot cement boat at that time. It appeared to be the craze. We ended up in Long Island for a while, and then that wasn't quite the fit, and then we ended back up in Upper Michigan, up on Lake Superior. But my grandparents lived in Wisconsin in the Appleton area, a town called Kaukauna. Lived there their entire lives. My mom was born there, and they're my connection to Jun Fujita. So my grandfather, who lived in Kaukauna, his sister married Jun. And of course, they were their main hub was in Chicago, and so Chicago was everything. And when you were in Wisconsin, when you were in Michigan, you could go to the Twin Cities, but it was always going to grandma's house. And then if they was in Wisconsin, and then if you wanted to go somewhere, really big, you went to Chicago.
I think that, and I was trying to remember this the other day, I had seen a post that you had done on maybe Instagram or something, and I thought, oh, this sounds really great. I reached out to you and said, when you're ready, when the book is ready, I would love to interview you. And I think that was years ago. So I'm glad we finally connected, because I ordered the book the minute it became available, and was excited when I got it a couple weeks ago or a month or two ago. And anyway, I'm giddy to talk to you about this.
Wow.
So the book is called Jun Fujita Behind the Camera. You say in your book that you grew up hearing stories of your great uncle Jun. Do you remember whether you were impressed by those stories as a kid from the get-go, or did it take a little time for you to understand his importance?
Yeah, Jun, at the time, being around my grandparents and listening to my mom talk about Jun, honestly, even then, he felt kind of like a superhero. He was kind of like this. They held him up on a really high pedestal, as and the more you kind of learned about him, you're like, gosh, this man could do everything and anything, and he really was just amazing. The photos of his were always around the house. Things kind of got handed down through the family. So like the bed I slept in for years was the bed that came from the Kite, for example, his house in Indiana. When I went to college, I took one of his Hudson Bay blankets with me, this big heavy wool blanket. So Jun was just always present. There was this shelf of books of his that were set apart from everything else. My grandparents had all kinds of books, but there was this one shelf that had these kind of books that belonged to June, and they all had darker covers, and those were kind of off limits, as I recall, which was kind of at the time I was like, what are these things? So that was some things I didn't learn and know about until later, and it is one of my regrets that I really didn't start asking questions until after my grandparents had passed away. But fortunately, my mom was a treasure trove and remembered everything. So it was a wonderful research project that really was a great team effort with me and my mom.
Do you remember stories from when you were a kid? Did you have like a favorite story that was shared with you that you just loved and kind of grabbed onto?
The story that I, when I tell this, I never get the uproarious laughter that it always had when I was a kid. But there was this story about why June may have left Japan, which was always sort of a mystery because he left Japan as a young boy and really never returned, never looked back. But there's this story about him falling in love with a teacher at a young age, writing her a letter, and this letter gets found out in the town. Everybody suddenly knows about this letter, and June is his love, and there's this huge embarrassment. And um, I think it was probably my grandfather who said, or no, then June would say, "I walked in the shadow of my teacher," meaning like great shame. And then and then Grandpa Wayne would say, "Well, what do you do on a cloudy day?" Meaning, you know, there's no shadow there, and everyone was laughing, and they're all sitting around in the kitchen, all talking about stories about June.
For photography fans and I think news fans, Jun Fujita is fairly well known. Obviously, he's become more well known over the years and with your book. But honestly, he's not a widely known figure in American history, despite being a pioneering photographer. So, for people listening, he was there to photograph the Eastland disaster in 1915. He was there for the race riots in 1919 and was the sole photographer to document the gruesome scene of the St. Valentine's Day massacre in 1929. Why do you think, up until somewhat recently, his work was not better recognized?
Well, and I think what's happened is the work has kind of eclipsed him in some way. So everybody knows those photographs. They've seen them, especially if you're regional to Chicago. But some of them have taken on global. I think you could walk anywhere around the globe and talk about the St. Valentine's Day massacre, for example. The Eastland disaster has always been kind of this also hidden story in Chicago. And I think there's just something about the kind of the disconnect between the photographer and the subject matter. It really is kind of mind-boggling to me. But as I think of the question, I think to myself, do I know the photographers of today's news? Not necessarily. They're probably better credited, which helps. Um, I think there's this. I think probably if we went back in time and we were with June while he was in his prime doing news photography, you would probably say he was a minor celebrity. I think people knew him. So, when Al Capone saw June, he knew who he was and vice versa. And so there's probably this circle of people who who knew each other, but somehow that circle dissolves over time, and it's a mystery and it's a shame, and it's part of the reason why I wrote the book to keep the story alive.
I will say, somewhat embarrassedly, I was not always good about reading the photo credits. I was not always good about even reading the byline of stories. And
Yeah,
now when I go back and do research, I see names that I recognize and people that I've met over the years. And I can reach out to them and go, "Oh my gosh, I read something that you wrote in 1978 that was in the Sun Times. So
yeah.
cool. Can I
Well,
ask you questions about that?"
there's a marvelous photo of a group of photojournalists at the time. It's probably mid 40s, 30s in that time frame, probably 30s, and it's just like it's a smaller group of people than you thought. So chances are the photos you're researching, if they were taken in Chicago, were probably just taken by under what, a dozen people.
Yeah, I think even now I see the same people, Black Club
Yeah,
Chicago, Sun Times, and the Tribune, and I think, All these events happen on the same day. You must have just been ping-ponging around the city to be able to find all these places and take your pictures and, get
Yeah,
somewhere. Fortunately, people now don't have to develop. I don't know how many of them are shooting on film. I'm guessing it's all digital and they can
yeah,
upload it, but poor June had to get all of his stuff developed
yeah.
before he was able to, get it to print. So, if I read correctly, you've been working on this book for 15 years. What finally compelled you to write this biography?
It's really my wife we have to thank for that. So I'm an only child, so a lot of the family archives and history kind of fell to me eventually. There were these two green boxes of negatives that my grandfather had that had belonged to June, and I'd had them for several years, not really knowing much about them, knowing they were June's, but yes, I'll save them, of course. Um, then I don't know, one day got me thinking about them and started to dig into it and scanned a couple in, and it was just an amazing process to see these photographs, negatives come to life, and some of the color ones were especially intriguing because there were actually three black and white negatives in the sleeve, and you'd pull them out. And it was kind of a riddle. I thought I had three different pictures, but there was really just one. And through some research and trial and error, I realized I could combine them in Photoshop and put one in the red, the green, and the blue channel. And suddenly I had this color photograph. But after the excitement of this, I'm like, cool, now what? My wife and I were on a bike ride, and it was one of those conversations, her yelling over to me and me yelling over, like, I've got these negatives. I think you should write a book, she says. And I'm like, a book, really? And I've got a graphic arts background, and so I started pulling this all together. And the original intent was just to preserve it, document it, and maybe I'd print three copies and give one to each of my family members and call it a day. And of course, that didn't happen. It just grew and it grew. And suddenly I realized in this research that there were people waiting for me to contact them, even though they didn't know I exist. So the Poetry Foundation, for example, was so excited that I'd reached out to them. They had information in their catalogs. The Eastland Disaster Society said they were waiting for a relative of Fujita to contact them. And I found that throughout my research that people were just waiting. And it developed this, I called it my Fujita family. It just kind of kept growing and growing. And truly, that was really the most marvelous thing of this project was developing these race relationships around this kind of common subject.
Well, certainly the number of people that weighed in, and I have the book right next to me, who weighed in and wrote pieces for you or were willing to go back to his hometown in Japan and see what's still available, and is there any portion of his house that he grew up in, that kind of thing. I thought was amazing, really, the idea that so many people would come together and try to help keep his story alive. So.
Yeah.
You mentioned his poetry. Jun Fujita was both a photographer and a poet. He was referred to as perhaps the first master of Tanka poetry in English. Tell us a little bit about that style of poetry and why do you think Jun was so enamored with it?
Well, Tanka is similar to a haiku poem, so they're very short. They're very structured, similar to haiku poems. June took a little different. He was a little more loose with the form. He would bend it to his desired outcome, and he is the word that comes up when he's talking about the Tanka is that he's looking to paint a mood. So he's trying to express a mood about something, whether it's the favorite topics are in the Indiana Dunes, a lot of nature poems, real detailed, precise um, editing process. He could spend, I don't know, I wouldn't be surprised if over a year's worth of time he would come back and correct one or two words. He would place all of his poems along this long wooden table, and he would kind of go from one to the next, right down the list, making slight changes and adjustments. And it started for him really as kind of a challenge to himself. He was at an event where someone was reading some poetry, some Tanka poetry, and Jun was in kind of a typical fashion, just sort of, well, that is not Tanka poem. I can do better than that. And he set off himself on creating this Tanka poetry, and he did. He had his first book published in 1923 to, I would say, great acclaim. There's only 365 copies plus a couple proofs out there, so it's kind of fun to see where they're at. And he had a second version of unpublished poems, a little different, some Tanka in there too, but some a little more, kind of metaphysical poems and stories, which is kind of interesting. So when you compare the two, you can kind of see this journey that maybe he's on from his early writing to his later years. But he never stopped. So once he got hooked onto this writing poetry, I think he latched onto it.
Your great uncle Jun arrived in Chicago during a period of significant, let's call it anti-Asian sentiment here in America. How do you think he navigated that hostility, and did it shape the subjects that he chose to photograph?
It's a great question. My impression of Jun and how he handled adversity was through confidence. He really carried himself with this air of poise and assuredness. I think it had to do partially with his connection with photography, being able to insert himself into situations, whether it was race riots. Like I can't even imagine being a Japanese man chasing after rioting situations and not having the mob turn their attention on him. Um, so I think maybe that camera and plus his confidence shielded him somewhat. He wasn't immune to it, however. So he had a cabin on Rainy Lake in northern Minnesota. His wife had to buy it for him. He wasn't able to purchase property at that time up until in the 20s and 30s, and then at the beginning of World War II, suddenly it became unsafe. The locals around that area started referring to it as the Jap Island, for example. There were signs around it. He never felt safe again going back up to it after World War II started.
Jun appeared, if I read correctly, as a silent film actor for Chicago's S&A Studios, playing the hero's valet in the 1915 thriller Otherwise Bill, one of the many S&A Studios films that appears lost to the ages. Is there any indication that he wanted to be an actor in addition to his other pursuits, or was that just to help pay the bills?
I think it was, kind of that I'm new in Chicago. I've got this kind of new, I've just graduated high school. I need to do something next. I think he got wrapped up in that kind of American dream of like, I'm going to be an actor. This is what I'm going to do. And for a long time, I really thought, come on, he wasn't in a silent movie. I've got no documentation. I got no proof. I got nothing. And it kind of sat out there for years and years. It's like, I don't even know if I should mention it. And then finally, it was this professor from DePaul University. She found a magazine, a movie magazine, and it had a picture, several pictures of Jun in this role from the movie. And it was like, at the moment, it was like the holy grail of like, oh my gosh, we found it. It's true. So I think it's lovely that became kind of like a young man's dream. But then obviously it didn't pay the bills, and he was enrolled in night school, and he was looking for more work, and that's when his quote, which I think is wonderful, is he drifted into the Chicago Evening Post, and they gave him a job on the spot.
I know the excitement of finding something like that when you've been looking and thinking that it doesn't exist, and
Yeah,
then all of a sudden somebody says, "Oh, I've got an old movie magazine with it."
right.
What were some of the other things that you discovered or that you had trouble finding, and then finally they showed up on your doorstep, or somebody said, "Oh, I've got one of those," and your great uncle is in it?
Um, One of the truly remarkable things have been after some publicity. If I'm in I was mentioned in I was interviewed for a Chicago Evening Post article. Somebody invariably reaches out to me with more information. I think without a doubt, the largest contribution was by another Chicago photographer, Orlando Cabanban, who in his own right should have a book written about him. He's amazing. He was connected with June and Florence in later years as June was declining in health. He was helping Florence take care of June. After June passed away, Florence gave Orlando a set of June's wildflower photographs as well as June's last effects, which were in of all things, an ottoman, the ones that, you lift up and there's a container there. It was just filled with letters from Japan, childhood pictures, things that so enriched the understanding and the story that I didn't know they existed. I'd never seen any Japanese writing, for example, in any of the things that were saved by my grandfather and my mother. So this was something that just opened up a whole new avenue of research and inquiry, and it was a treasure trove. I can't thank Orlando enough.
The word that came to mind was treasure trove, and all I could think was, well, that must have added another 9 months to a year to working on the book, just having to go through all that and try to suss some of it out.
There were several iterations where I thought, well, I think I'm winding down. I think this might be it. And then something would happen and it'd be like, all right, stop the presses.
Yeah, I need a little more time. And you
That's
know
right.
what? It's the book is all the better for it.
It really is. And it was always part, this is not my full-time job. I've just kind of been working on this as I navigate through the weeks and years here. And it's it's been such an enriching, fulfilling project and we've been doing it for so long now. It's just become a part of my life. I still find myself just Googling my resources out there on the internet and like, I wonder if anything else is digitized. Yeah.
Jun Fujita was also one of the first photographers to document Chicago's architectural landmarks and urban landscapes. You mentioned the dunes, for example, where he took a lot of pictures. Was this a natural extension of his love of all photography, or do you think that he did news photography to pay the bills, but landscapes is really what he preferred to capture?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it points to his upbringing in Japan. I think even though he might say that he's put that behind him, I think he carries it with him regardless, with that love of the natural water environment, his time in Canada with the salmon industry and lumber industry that he was photographing, his connection to the Rainy Lake area there where he would bring clients up to photograph. I think the poetry also kind of infused that love of nature. And of course, his home in the Indiana Dunes. I think he developed into this conservationist just out of instinct. He loved camping. He loved being out in the outdoors. And I think it's a lovely contrast from his life in Chicago. And it does feel like a flip side of the coin where you're in Chicago and, photographing city life, and then you can adventure out of that and recharge perhaps, even though I think he's perfectly charging himself in Chicago as well. I think you get energy in both places.
The next question that I had, you've kind of answered, but I'm going to read it anyway because there may be more to it. Your
Yeah.
book focuses on what June captured behind the camera. What does that phrase mean to you, and what hidden or lesser known dimensions of Fujita's life and work does it reveal?
For me, coming up with the title was tricky. There were several ideas around it. And then I realized that um, putting him, you know, he's not the subject matter of his photographs. And in fact, there's not a whole lot of photographs of June himself, certainly no selfies. And, I found that what we were talking about was the man behind the camera. And there's one photograph to me that just stands out that just says so much to me. And it's a photograph of that June took of my grandfather, June's best friend, at the um, at the bow of a boat. So I can picture the two of them out in the water, both in the boat, and the grin on my grandfather's face as he's looking across at his best friend says it all to me. So to me, it's that kind of relationship between the photographer and the subject, whether it's a person or an inanimate object or nature.
I know the picture you're talking about, and it is pretty great. It's such a wonderful capture from a long ago era, but yeah, you can see just the affection, emanating from his face,
Yeah,
being photographed by his friend.
yeah.
I read in Rick Hogan's column about your book in the Chicago Tribune that Al Capone invited Great Uncle June to a Thanksgiving charity dinner with a note that read, "Bring your camera," and is said to have offered him a job. Please talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's one of those apocryphal family stories, and another one of those that was told around the kitchen table. To to get the full weight of it, you should know that June was kind of good with knives. He was, he could, like a circus performer, he could throw a knife and make it stick into a tree. There's some story about him, sticking it into a head of a poisonous snake or something. There's something about knives in his background. He's he's walking down Michigan Avenue, and a big black car rolls up beside him. The rear window uh, goes down, and Al Capone sticks out his head and says, "June, I hear you're good with knives." And June replies, "I'm better with a camera." And Capone says, "That's too bad. We would have called you Chopstick." June goes home to Florence and says, "I think Al Capone just offered me a job in his gang." Of course, he never accepted, but it shows a little bit of the kind of relationship that you have with your subject when you're a newspaper person, I think. So it was always said that that Al Capone favored June because he would take pictures of his scar-free side. So I don't know if
Always got his good side.
always got his good side,
So,
but you don't want to get too close. He never accepted the invitations to the Thanksgiving dinners.
hmm. Yeah, that's maybe a good thing overall. In the 1930s, Jun Fujita left photojournalism and established a commercial photography studio. Why do you think he did that? He wasn't very old. Did he get burned out? I think one of the newspapers that he was working for closed, but there were still plenty of newspapers around, right?
Yeah, I think to me it feels like everything just kind of hit all at once. So the Chicago Evening Post was absorbed by the Daily News. He was at the Daily News for several months from what I can determine. And I think it is right around that time that he started this commercial business. So I think maybe he saw the closing of one business as an opportunity to try something new. So he traded in newspaper for more of a commercial photography, and there's some lovely examples of all kinds of customers around Chicago that he was taking photography for. From the Elgin Watch Factory is one I can think of right off the bat. Several advertising companies, seed catalogs. He took a lot of pictures of food, and it seemed like it opened up an opportunity for him to step back and kind of stage things a bit more, I think, probably. So rather than reacting to the news, he was able to kind of define what he was doing.
Sure, less running around and more control over how he spent his days. It
Yeah,
doesn't sound terrible when it's described
yeah.
that way. You conducted extensive research for the book, archives, interviews, obviously family documents. What do you feel was the most valuable source you discovered, and how did it change your understanding of your great uncle?
Yeah, I'd be remiss in saying that for sure the conversations I had with my mother really just gave kind of a heart to the stories. So her recollections really um, just gave a warmth to all the facts, which was wonderful. Um, but then it was a number of the institutions that I've talked about already. So the Eastland Disaster Historical Society, they were marvelous. Little pockets of historical societies in other locations, taking a trip up to Rainy Lake to visit the cabin, which still stands, really was like going through a time capsule. The the ranger there, for example, said that much of the trees look much the same as when June had lived there because it's colder and things grow slower. It really was just like walking in June's footsteps, as it were. So that was marvelous. We've made wonderful connections with people at the Indiana Dunes. There's the Schoolhouse Shops, which is right across from where June's cabin was. They're a fabulous connection and a great destination for Christmas shopping. So yeah, there's the people that I met are really truly the greatest resources. I'm thankful for the internet and just being able to search archive.org and newspapers that are digitized. Yeah, suddenly, it really, the internet makes things available for people that might not think they can find things possible.
I'm hopeful the Chicago History Museum was helpful as well.
Oh my gosh,
Yes?
how can I forget the Chicago History Museum? Thank you. The research team at the museum, um, oh my gosh, when there were things that I couldn't figure out, a newspaper photograph, for example, that I wanted some more information, the team there, Leslie, oh my gosh, yeah, I couldn't. The way they were able to pull information up and send stuff back, I'm so thankful for.
It is a joy to be up there on the research level and just how quickly they're able to get stuff, which isn't always on site, and get it back. And it's a
Yeah.
joy. It's a joy that I think more people should take advantage of, not just history nerds like me and you.
Yeah, a huge shout out to everybody who's like the guardians of history, because that's really what it feels like. So it's they're everyone from librarians to the research people out there. I couldn't be more thankful for.
Great Uncle June was involved in Chicago's literary and cultural circles. What was his role in the city's intellectual life, and why is that part of his legacy often forgotten?
I think because, in some of the ways that he was influential were were less documented. So, for example, he would host parties, and it was a kind of a favorite destination of people who were visiting. So, if Hemingway was in town or Faulkner was in town, they would want to connect with June and often would attend parties, and you'd have some authors around the table. You'd have a detective from the police force at the table. You'd have professors from the Chicago um, University of Chicago, and you can just kind of imagine the topics that they would cover. And they would often June was often silent, I'm told, and that he'd be listening, and then people would turn to him and say, June, what do you have to say about that? And then he would make some kind of gesture and pronounce something that were often wise. And um, I think he just became this kind of hub in a way for this conversation. He found his community in the kind of Jackson Park art community full of artists. And he was definitely at the Dill Pickle Club. That's where he found that's where he found his people.
Speaking of which, he did not spend a lot of time within the Japanese community within Chicago.
Yeah, he really, he again, he was just kind of this solitary figure in a way that he didn't feel like he needed to be around Japanese people, I think. He had found his community around artists and journalists and like-minded people, I guess. And I don't think he differentiated between like I need to be in my a Japanese community. I think he was just looking for like-mindedness. I think that's probably a good way to say it. And then um, uh, yeah, I think then he just once he had his kind of group of people, that's all he needed, and he kind
Sure.
of went through life with them.
Did you face any challenges? You mentioned World War II and how he felt unsafe at his own cabin up in Minnesota. Did you face any challenges in telling the story of a Japanese American during a period where Japanese Americans faced profound discrimination? I mean, during and after World War II, obviously things weren't quite as treacherous here in Chicago as they were out west with internment camps and such. But how do you, as an author, approach that history with sensitivity?
I think you just have to kind of start with the facts of what you know and kind of build from there. So June certainly wasn't immune to prejudice at the time, but in some ways it was kind of spoken about lightheartedly. So in years leading up to the war, the photographers and people he was working with, June was traveling across the country taking pictures for the WPA projects. So think tunnels and big construction projects and bridges. Um, the joke was like, June, imagine if they see you standing on the um, Hoover Dam with a camera, you're going to be in big trouble with the government. And everyone would kind of chuckle and chuckle. But then when Germany invaded Poland in 39, and June was suddenly labeled an enemy alien, it was kind of like his worst nightmare of like, well, what does this mean? Things were changing fast. He had his assets frozen, so this commercial photography shop was inaccessible. His funds were frozen at the bank. Things were looking kind of grim. So um, it points back to, again, this community and connection that he had built. The saving grace in all this was that he had his editor from the Chicago Evening Post in the early days at that time during World War II was in the Department of Interior. And so there was this immediate like connection, letters being written back and forth between the two of them, trying to vouch for June's, vouching for his integrity. And eventually, things loosened up. It didn't mean that he was immune from things like having to sign affidavits and paperwork, getting him to cross borders to go to his cabin at the Indiana Dunes. He was under scrutiny, and I'm sure it was not great.
To use part of the title from your book, are there other aspects of June's personal life, his relationships, his struggles, his aspirations that remain behind the camera or unknowable? And how did you handle any gaps in the historical record?
Some of the early stuff are particularly hard, like his life in Canada really is undocumented as far as I know. That's another one of those, gosh, something's got to turn up sometime. A picture of something that he took in Canada, something in a publication that it's just not digitized yet, or I don't know where to find it. Um, so those chapters get a little skinny. You can kind of hypothesize what is going on, but I don't want to make any real guesses. So I go with what I can verify either through research or through conversations with my family, stories I remember. I do think it's a challenge to completely paint a picture of a person's life, and June had a full one. So there's going to be new things that I'm going to discover, and I'll treasure those. I'll be sad they're not in the book, but it'll be part of the story. We'll have an addendum somewhere.
I was going to say if they come along and you're able to put them in when the book goes to second printing, third printing, fourth printing, how great will
Oh,
that be?
I love the sounds of that, Tommy.
Sure, you got to have the optimism. What do you hope contemporary photographers and artists will take away from learning about Jun Fujita's work and legacy?
Well, I like to think that people can look at June's life journey, and you can look at it in different ways, whether it's the nature photography or the news photography or the immigration story or the conservation story. They're all stories that are still pertinent today. And to see how he navigated that, I think can give you a kind of a guide. Um, so if you're looking to see how someone else was successful at it, and you want to take bits and pieces of it, by all means. And I think June's story just sort of transcends himself in a way. It's a bigger story than him, and so I think in telling these stories, I think we can find ways to connect with each other.
You became a digital archaeologist, uncovering and piecing together snapshots taken over 70 years plus ago. Were you adept at this already, or were you kind of learning as you went along?
Oh, I'm always learning. Some of my early efforts are kind of pale in later ones, but you do the best you can, and you just kind of move forward, I think. So there was some things that maybe I could have, had I been more forward thinking, like I should scan this in case I need it for a poster. I hadn't thought of that. Or what if someone needs this for a video presentation? Oh, shoot, the resolution, I didn't quite think quite far enough. So if I had to go back, there would be some things I would change there. Probably should have had some conversations with the Chicago Historical Society. They would have set me straight right off the bat.
June once said of his lack of desire for fame, "Does the polished stone on the shore of Lake Michigan yearn to move the ocean? I am that stone." I don't really have a question. I just thought it was so great for somebody who we're talking about today, all these years after his death. Probably could have had a lot more fame had he pursued it in different ways, but he seems like he was pretty content with the life that he had. He found his love. He found places that for a time he felt safe. I think it's a wonderful thing. Certainly in the fame obsessed world that we're in today.
I love that so much, and I appreciate you saying that. That really is lovely, and it's hard to know. I don't know how you measure fame. Really, there's you know, I think he was kind of a mod, someone I talked with through all this called June a rock star of his time, which I kind of think is kind of cool. I have a book of his Tanka that I found on Etsy for $30, of if you can believe it, who signed to Jean Harlow. And I love to imagine, like, well, what was that interaction like? Was he where? How did that happen? Um, but I think at the end of it, he's a photographer, he's a poet, and a lot of those things are kind of introspective pursuits. A lot of time in the dark room, a lot of time by yourself writing. I think June was very comfortable with his inner self, and so I don't think he was seeking fame, but he was, again, that's this kind of confidence what just kind of drew people towards him.
Speaking of fame, what do you think June would say about all the attention being given his life and work all these years later?
That's a good one. I think he would probably push it to the side and say, let's let's go hiking in the dunes. We don't need to do this. Let's go tramping the dunes. We'll pack a lunch and we'll spend all day there.
Leads me to my last question. If you had just one question to ask of your great Uncle June, what would it be?
Gosh, that's a great one. I I would I would want to ask him to I would want to know more about his life in Japan and how he grew up. Tell me more about your family, what you remember about it. Fill in some of the blanks there about your early years journeying here. Could we know a lot about what happened when you came here, but can you tell us more about maybe why you left, what you left behind?
Jun Fujita behind the camera. Graham Harrison Lee is the author, and I got to tell you, I really enjoyed this book and this conversation. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. I appreciate the time so much. I love sharing June's story. I think it's fascinating, and thanks again for your time. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to this episode about Jun Fujita. Special thanks to my guest today, Graham Harrison Lee. The second printing of his book, Jun Fujita Behind the Camera, is available for pre-order. Ask for it at your local bookstore or order it through the links in the show's notes. As always, if you have any questions about anything covered today, anything to add, or have an idea for a future episode, I'd love to hear about it. Send me an email at chicagohistorypod@gmail.com. I have links to items related to Chicago's amazing history in the show's notes if you or someone you know is a history nerd like me who would like to learn more. Anything ordered through those links, not just the items listed, may earn a small commission for the podcast and help offset production costs at no additional cost to you. Check out the Chicago History Podcast social media pages for articles and pictures related to this episode and past episodes posted throughout the week. Much of the original art for the Chicago History Podcast used on the social media pages was created by John K. Schneider. A sincere thanks, friend. If you need creative work done, you'll find no one better. Send him an email at angeleyesartjks@gmail.com. I will be back soon with more stories from Chicago's history. Until then, get out and explore when possible. Learn more about whatever city you live in, and stay safe.